publication in relationship to modernity. Jessica, could you read?
There is a history of counter-rhythmical modernity that begins with Romanticism, symbolism, Dada, surrealism, and situationism. These movements contested not only the relationship of art and politics, but also the formation of the play of word and image. Journals and publications played a central role in defining the radical approaches to figures such as the fragment, poetics, the unconscious, montage, and revolution. The Antheum was a journal started in 1798 by the Schlegel brothers. As the founding publication of German Romanticism, it ceased in 1800.
So one of the characteristics of these publications is very often they're very short-lived. They quite a number of them last for 2 3 years, but have a kind of enormous impact over a period of time. They almost act as a kind of a sort of rupturing sense and producing a sort of another rhythm of thinking.
Many of the Jenner Romantic texts take the form of the fragment, to the extent that the fragment assumes the role of the genre within this phase of Romanticism. There are three main traits of the fragment: incompletion, the heterogeneous nature of the assembled elements, and a sense of a final unity that occurs outside of such an assemble. In the Athenaeum by Friedrich Schlegel, he states that the fragment has to be complete in itself, like a hedgehog. The isolation of each fragment in itself corresponds to completion. There has been growing attention paid to this short-lived episode, and this publication is a testament to this.
This is a summary, a kind of overview of the theories of literature in German Romanticism. So it's a literary movement. It was mainly philosophical, poetic movement.
I was thinking it kind of, we sort of bemoaned in this group before about, whether at the present, we're sort of suffering from a sort of a loss of ability to hold attention and, perhaps read a book all the way through. And I think, I wonder whether this kind of like style of writing, it sort of lends itself to our age because it's something where you can just read a page or a paragraph and, have a sort of a complete thought to take away with. So maybe this is like the writing of the future. It's like 150 words at a time.
I mean, it's like the piece you're going to present is a kind of aphorism, isn't it?
Mm.
As a form. So it's a
And even then, I still feel like it's got too many words. So it's interesting. I feel like it needs to get even shorter. It's more like, you know, posting on Twitter than than anything else now. The number of words is ever going down.
the following from Romanticism. I mean, I'm emphasizing this idea of a counter-rhythmical modernity, a kind of a modernity which goes from Romanticism through to symbolism, through to Dada and Surrealism and Situationism. So it's not a complete overview of publications and modernity.
The publication Block was an example of early Russian avant-garde art, literature, and culture. It was the symbolist poet Alexandra Bloch whose writing inspired the publication.
Yeah, fairly short-lived publication.
Blast was a short-lived journal founded by Wyndham Lewis and assisted by Evra Pound. It ran for just 2 issues in 1914 and 15 and was centered on the Vorticist movement. What's Vorticism?
It's like an English variety of futurism. So it had a kind of, it was sort of quite right wing. Ezra Pound, I've spelled Ezra wrong. Um, Ezra Pound was seen as anti-Semitic, and a certain sort of glorification of war. So this second issue was on called the war number.
Because the cover looks very Soviet style of that sort of communist approach.
Yeah, it's
So
like the fusion with a fusion between futurism, um, supremacy. I mean, a lot of those forms merged. Came out as sort of futuro-cubism, we call that.
yeah.
But we get a new sense of not just of new writing, but new kind of graphical formulation, a new way of understanding the fragmentation of word and image, and new sort of forms of typography, and a fusion between the poets and the avant-garde artists. So very often these movements were led by poets.
Surrealism was both an aesthetic and political movement whose aim was to transform life.
So again, surrealism was primarily a poetic movement, or certainly in its early stages was more poetic than uh, aesthetic, and had a political agenda.
Documents were edited by Georges Bataille from 1929 to 1930 for 15 issues. Bataille said that it was a war machine against received ideas.
So Bataille was the other wing of surrealism in opposition to um, there's two main wings, the so-called Pope of surrealism and Georges Bataille.
It's interesting that so many of them are so short-lived, isn't it? It's probably just like a testament to um, how much work it is to run something like this, and you're probably not, getting compensated for doing it whilst you are, right? Nor not sufficiently.
But it was the in-between of a manifesto and a movement. It
Mm.
kind of defined, it went beyond the manifesto and couldn't quite embody the whole of the movement.
Mm.
How would they sell these documents? Because I noticed it got a little price of 15 francs, I think.
Mm.
Was it done through news stores or
I just think
cafes or
cafes and informal
right? Yeah.
to, to fellow travelers in a way,
Mm.
as much a call to arms of fellow travelers as it was to a public. I mean, it probably didn't have very much of a public. And we also get in surrealism, in this Max Ernst producing his graphic work in book form in order to stimulate a narrative, but it's just based on a disjunctive space of dreams.
The magazine was founded in 1951 and was largely influenced by the theories of Andre Bazin. In the mid-50s, a younger generation assumed editorial control that included Godard, Roma, Rivette, Truffaut, who were themselves interested in the idea of making films. This in turn became known as the French New Wave and was based upon an auteur notion of cinema.
So where it was like they went away from looking at Hollywood-based films to looking at mainly French and European cinema.
After experimenting with some short films, Godard produced Breathless, which introduced the jump cut and handheld camera shooting.
So this new style of which Breathless kind of characterized was casual looking on location. So it was used the street and handheld cameras quite a lot, natural lighting, improvisation of lines and actions. So a lot of improvisation, moving cameras out as a handheld, discontinuous editing, jump cuts are common, and the long take.
Godard continually experimented with montage and with it, the relationship between word, image, and sound. 2 or 3 Things I Know About Her in 1967 was an epitome of this process.
There's a still from the famous coffee cup scene, which we've looked at several times. But 1967 was a key, it was a year in which it was about the same time as Situationist, international Situationist movement was publishing magazines and introducing ideas like the spectacle and
with the film Numero 2, 1975, Godard utilized video production techniques. This signaled the end of traditional cinema for Godard, and with it the advent of multi-textual combinations on the screen. The Situationist International was formed in 1957 and dissolved in 1972. It was based upon a synthesis of radical politics and the influence of Dada surrealism and lettrism. What's lettrism?
it was started in the 50s. It was like a post-surrealist radical, based mainly on filmmaking and on poetry and collage, but it was a pre-runner to surreal to situationism.
Debord followed the publication with a film essay with the same title. It was composed of the voiceover appropriated images. In the 1960s and 70s, there were different projects that explored the relationship between publication and aesthetic and political forms. Each episode was short-lived except for semiotext, and in turn the influences varied in duration. Signals Gallery 1964 to 66 was an experimental art gallery that also published a news bulletin instead of the usual catalogues for shows. The editor was the artist David Medella.
So what these publications were like, which only lasted for 2 years, but it's continued to be a kind of big influence in certain sections of the art world. There's here a quote from Mayakovsky.
The gallery was exemplified mainly by exhibitions of kinetic art, which was marked by its opposition to aesthetic formalism. Medalla mixed a whole range of preoccupations ranging from pre-Socratic philosophy, quantum physics, Buddhist ethics, countercultural impulses, cybernetics, participation, ecological and radical politics. Rather than creating a dialogue to present the latest exhibition, there was instead a body of writing that might produce a revigoration of the artwork in ways that transformed the very idea of a context.
So fairly low, I mean, in terms of today's printing and electronic media, it's a fairly basic publication.
So the term cybernetics, how would that be, during that time? How would that be described?
Well, they're interested obviously in cybernetics. So one of the features about kinetic art was it's linked to cybernetic theory.
Right.
The 1960s say the growth of artists' writing and publication as an art form.
So the most distinguished one was art and language, which was very much based on more on the idea of analytical philosophy than continental philosophy. But it's artists writing independently of criticism, doing their own criticism. You see there Solowit, Dan Graham, Lawrence Weiner, all major artists, Michael Baldwin, all major artists of conceptual art movement.
Provoke, Provocative Materials for Thought, was an experimental magazine which was founded in 1968. There were only 3 issues, but it had a profound impact upon Japanese photography in the 1970s. The magazine served to introduce a distinct aesthetic based on a look of grainy, rough, blurry, or out of focus. Provoke challenged the way politics, subjectivity, the image, editing process, and writing might open out fresh perceptions within the process of making manifest. One of the implications of such projects was a refiguration of not only what constitutes photography and the essay form within this, but also the behavioral structures through which realization occurs. The perceiving subject and the intended object are thus indivisible from a unity and create a force as a consequence of this. Rather than serving as an aesthetic model, this episode exemplifies the motion and rupture of manifestation that weaves discrete threads of history within the saturation of resistance to what is present. The out of focus, blurry, tightly cropped look is nothing other than the dissolution of knowing in advance of appearance, or the not knowing of the passage of arrival.
So it's very typical of the editing where it's very disjunctive and it's not got a prefigured look. It's not got an obvious form of juxtaposition. It's surprising.
Mm.
It uses dramatically the 2 pages, so the white line in the middle as a kind of splits the subject, as it were. It's almost a graphical notation, and there's also has a sort of another nuance to it, which is more philosophical.
Although it only had 3 editions, Provoke was part of the growth of photographers working in book form and often writing essays to complement the images. Radio Alice was a short-lived radio station based in Bologna in 1976 to 77. Its aim was centered upon developing new forms of communication that mix the political with the poetic in order to produce surprising textures of speech. Radio Alice was also connected to the publication Attraverso.
So Radio Alice is based upon the idea of Alice in Wonderland. And it was a free radio station which was based on not just free speech, but also experimental speech. So often mixed surrealist text with political text with fictions and interviews and sound pieces. This is the office of Radio Alice.
Does someone want to take over reading?
Yeah, I'll take over. In part, the station developed out of the radical publication A Traverso, which was based upon the desire to go through the looking glass of language, which referred to Lewis Carroll's novel. This publication drew upon the traditions of Dada, Surrealism, Situationism, and post-structuralism in order to create a vision of a post-capitalist, post-industrial community of speaking subjects creating polyvocal spaces of expression in which lines of thought are no longer drawn into a governing political center of power, but instead transform space into a mobile, diffuse confluence of desiring intensities. Both Radio Alice and A Traverso sought to break free of the coupling of the signified and the signifier as the center of semiotic stability in order to let the body speak, thus interrupting the language of the machine.
So it's a sort of direct. There was Deleuze and Guattari were big influences on it. The project Schizophrenia and Capitalism, and this invention of a new way of writing philosophy or a new way of figuring speech acts. You can also see this idea of semiotic stability in order to let the body speak is the influence of Julia Kristeva. So it directly linked to avant-garde political theories and philosophy and the street, as it were, relative to the street. And there was big student uprising in this period. So Radio Alice was the voice of that uprising. It also mutated into forms of street theatre and actions. So the protest was seen as partly aesthetic, a live aesthetic.
Semiotext, Semiotext 1974 was firstly a journal and then a publishing project based in New York that served to introduce radical, largely French and European theory and writing in ways that traversed politics, literature, semiotics, criticism, and aesthetics. This was exemplified by the publication Schizoculture. Did I pronounce that right? You might have to pick me up on pronunciations, which brought together the voices of Michel Foucault, John Cage, Kathy Acker, Gilles Deleuze, Jack Smith in order to disturb the orders of high and low culture. Partly, the project redefined the relationship between academic speech, countercultural voices, and political aesthetic transgressive gestures. This early constitution of the journal stimulated a generation of radical writers who desired new modes of literature, exemplified by Kathy Acker, Chris Kraus, Eileen Miles, and Cookie Mueller.
So all names which are very much in circulation now rather than in that period. So the future became much more based upon fiction now, fiction writing than political theories. These are early examples of semiotext. So a publication based on Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari, which popularized terms like desiring machines and bodies without organs. This is schizoculture, which I just referred to. These are the writers. So a whole generation of different writers drawn from different areas of the spectrum of the arts and literature and philosophy.
Semiotext is a magazine I started with a group of friends from Columbia University in 1974. I realized that each issue was a way of doing theory, the way artists do art, by establishing between found material, displaced documents, original essays, interviews, photographs, quotes, and so on, what Cage called a non-relationship with Deleuze and Guattari called, sorry?
Sorry.
Tariq, called
Yeah.
a non-disjunctive synthesis. Things can coexist together. Each can remain what is in its singularity, its own temporality, each preserving a life of its own whilst interpenetrating the other in a richer, more complex way. And this non-synthesis wasn't restricted to the space inside. To also was meant to hand thought between world outside that remained separate. Disparative milieus of artists, punks, young academics, activists, and others that existed apart, sliding each along the other without touching, like continental plates. Each issue was like an aphorism, an amalgam. I'm not sure what that is, of disparative forces waiting for something from without to give it meaning, looking simultaneously for different readerships and constantly changing readerships also made sure that you weren't caught in a single one. And that's by Sylvain
Oettinger.
Doing Theory in French Theory in America. I apologize for my bad pronunciations.
All right, part of the game we play.
Yeah, so please do assist me if I'm struggling.
Let me just trying to find the arrow. I've lost the arrow.
I can't see it. Ah, there it is.
I've got an arrow. This is Semiotext was the publication Autonomia was based on Italian writing, post-political writing, writers like Negri and Bifo. And these were typical of the small publications. They did numerous publications of Guattari and Baudrillard. I was the distributor in London of these in the first place. So I brought them to London.
Post-structuralism had a profound impact on artists and the language of art criticism. There was in turn a small revolution in the publication of artists' books based on the new technologies of desktop publication. Semiotext served to introduce a new form of readership to this arena of thought. October was formed in 1976 by Rosalind Krauss and Annette Michelson. The idea of the title came from a film reference of Einstein, which signaled both an impulse to examine radical modernist histories as well as emerging debates on postmodernism. Although its tone was largely academic, it mixed theories of art history, cinema critique, philosophy, and popular culture. In keeping with its tone, its design ethos was subdued.
So it's the standard book cover. Each one had a non-visual. It's very severe.
ZG magazine was firstly a London-based publication, which then shifted to New York. It explored new ways of writing about art and culture under different thematic approaches, such as desire and breakdown, without privileging the location of high culture. It had a 6-year self-life in the first part of the 1980s.
So this is typical of the covers. So that was the cover that Cindy Sherman made especially for ZG, sort of a reference to, obviously, to Marilyn. The cover by Mapplethorpe. But we got artists to, I was the London editor, but we got artists to do the covers. And it was a big format, so it's a fold-out format. But the desire, it was related to, on one side to Deleuze and Guattari, but on the other side to just a broader sense of a sort of desiring economy, as it were, a libidinal economy. This is a cover by Robert Longo.
There has been a marked development for curators to exhibit documents in conjunction with actual artworks. Museums and collectors are now paying for more attention to the textual sources and impulses within these documents because of what they reveal about the temporal paradigms of art.
So we've seen the growth of the vitrine in the last 10, 15 years in exhibitions. So just a quick snapshot that was. But it's enough material to discuss both that history, that discrete history I presented, and also the present conjunction of writing to the art world and publication to the art world. I mean, I've not included all the examples of artist books and any thoughts? Where did it take you with this just snapshot, really? Yeah, ZG. Well, it was the beginnings of postmodernity. So the first time postmodernity became a discussion, and a lot of the post-structuralist writers started to, sort of appear as references. So it started in St. Martin's, which had a very active cultural studies. So instead of art history, they had from the beginning, from a very early period, a kind of approach to cultural, what they call cultural studies, became the norm within art schools. But it was an atmosphere in which fashion and artists and fashion designers and sculptors and graphic designers were hanging, and filmmakers were hanging out with each other and exploring new ways of presenting work. So the magazine was meant to kind of be a combination of street culture with academic speech, with aesthetic, new forms of aesthetic milieus based on particularly photography and graphical art. So it was meant to embody a form of postmodernity in action. So it came at a particular junction where one order was giving way to another order, or one order was giving way to a disorder. I mean, St. Martin's, it was a period in which performative fashion started to emerge, and often artists did film backdrops and did club nights, and it was also in New York was the beginnings of graffiti art and hip hop culture, and so it's a kind of melting point between cultures of particularly London and New York at the time. And it sort of seemed to speak to New York culture more than, in the end, more than London culture. But it sort of did a vanishing act within New York. It became more of an art publication. It didn't really survive. It got some funding in New York from the equivalent of the Arts Council, but they cut off they just said we did a cover on which had a political implication. They cut the funding, so it lasted for about 16 issues. So it seems to be that most magazines, unless they're based upon academia, like October magazine is based really in a university and had funding from MIT Press and proper distribution. Unless there's that sort of solid structure of support and continuity, where editors are partly rely upon their own salaries to work for the magazines for free, they don't survive. But it had a very diverse. ZG had a very diverse readership. We distributed it through places like the ICA, but also bookshops and magazine shops. I mean, there's a magazine shop in just outside St. Martin's, and it used to sell something like 200 copies in one go. So most of its distribution was London and New York. Mm. I mean, it had circulation outside of London, but not so much. And there was like little readership groups formed. So they do study meetings around, like in Cardiff, there was a group which used to meet each time there was a publication, go through it together. So it had novel forms of readership. It wasn't just casual. It was also, there was some structure to it.
So I'm presuming that there was mention about the introduction of desktop publishing made the whole bringing together the magazine a lot easier than what it would have been in the past, because it would have been a much slower process. Would that have added to how successful it was?
I mean, there was more. I mean, at that juncture, when ZG was it, I mean, printing wasn't so expensive. So we did editions of 5,000, maybe sold 3,500. The desired copy sold out. Very rare now to actually be able to find a copy. They sell for 70, £80 now on the second-hand market.
Sorry.
Go on.
I was just going to say that I guess because of the way everything's gone with computers and stuff, and there's been an explosion of zines, and there's like zine book fairs. So now that it seems like now there's a complete plethora of publications, and then individual people making their own publications, and yeah, so it seems to have kind of gone from what you're describing with ZG to something almost like normal or typical. And then there's websites and stuff, but publishing and writing has really exploded, I think, since then.
Yeah, I think also Semitex had a big influence in terms of starting a sort of publishing of novels. in small format books. So they became both very popular, particularly within the art school milieu, but also in a broader sense. So it enabled a democratization of publishing to occur.
Yeah.
A veritable explosion of publishing. And, it's compared with when we had to do it sort of formal layout. You didn't have electronic layouts, and so it was quite slow going to do a publication.
I can still remember doing the cut, photocopying bits out, getting it printed, and then sticking it out onto bits of paper, and then working out the layout before the desktop publishing software came through, which just changed everything, made it so much easier, got so much more control, and it just made the process a lot quicker.
Yeah, you used to have to go and get it typed out in columns. There were all these little collectives that used to had a IBM golf ball, and they overnight became obsolete. Very expensive software, hardware became obsolete.
Jonathan, could you say something about Autonomia? Because you said you became the distributor. How did you get involved with that publication?
Well, I met Silver in New York, and I said I was distributing ZG, and I thought it'd be good to distribute ZG and Semiotext together. But Autonomia was, it's sort of interesting. I met in London Bifo and Guittaro at a meeting based on Autonomia, but it was also like swapping ideas to do with publications like ZG and Semiotext. So there's a kind of international network of political, philosophical, and more popular forms of aesthetic distribution. It was very loose, but there was a kind of. I remember doing a set of issues. There was a magazine called City Limits, which was an offshoot of another sort of magazine. But we did a
Time Out.
Time Out.
It was a more radical version of Time Out.
Yeah, it didn't survive, but economically it didn't survive. But we did a set of 10 issues, and we had writings of Kathy Acker, and for the first time in London, and Bifo, and so we brought together writers from New York, Italy, and London, just in an ordinary listings magazine. We did it with Malcolm Imrie, who went on to be the editor of Verso Press, and they published writers like Baudrillard and Berlioz and other writers such as that.
Amazing. Incredible that it went into City Limits.
What's that?
Incredible that it went into City Limits.
Yeah, they just agreed. We turned up for a meeting.
I used to get City Limits all the time.
We just turned up for a meeting and said we made a proposal. Malcolm Imrie was working on that magazine, and just said, "Yeah, just do it." And we had 10 issues of 300, 400, 500 word essays stuck in a listings magazine.
Do you have copies still?
No, I don't. I lose everything. It'd be quite an interesting document.
Yeah, very interesting. I doubt if there's many around.
No, I doubt anything survived. Malcolm Imrie, he probably much more careful than I was.
Amazing.
But it brought about a fusion of worlds, whereas before the art world and the philosophy world and political world were all their own distinct meeting points, and publishing was divided amongst them in equal regularity. It started to be mixed level writing, and more experimental writing started to come out of that. And with it, a revival of traditions. So in a way, things like Jane Romanticism were very obscure in this period, but slowly people started to notice, there was a group of writers in Germany at the turn of the 19th century that did interesting things. And so there'd always been interest in surrealist writing, but began to be a revival of those traditions. And as I say, as media changed, it changed the nature of publication. There was a fragmentation of publication, but also a sort of bigger constellation of it. I mean, if we had the energy, we could get together and do an online magazine. So it's how things begin. They start with a discussion or a confluence of people meeting together and want to make manifest what they're doing to the outside world.
I wonder, can we also go to some library to like take a look of some magazines like physically together?
I don't know where there's an archive. I don't know of any archive.
I just know in RCA there is a room for journalism.
Yeah, but that's just current journals.
Yeah, only current ones.
It's not a history of. There needs to be a project really where there's the history of these publications are drawn together. I mean, they become very obscure documents, very expensive, pulled together. So it's only. I mean, museums are paying more attention now to.
Yeah, maybe I'll do some research about it.
The women's art library might have some of those publications. Wouldn't be surprised.
Or maybe British Library?
Not so sure.
Or V&A research?
There'd be in the British Library. I think there'd be copies of these publications.
Right.
Yeah, and maybe before we go as a group, we can contact them to pull out those magazines that we want to take a look of.
I mean, it's also online, looking at the front covers and the contents.
Okay.
So if you like surrealist documents, there's sites where there's a whole lot of. I mean, separately, there's bound to be Ernst's photo books. And there's bound to be a place where there's all the Japanese photography books, but I doubt anyone has brought together a whole discrete history and got the publications which relate to that history. I mean, the original Provoke magazines are very rare now, but there's reproductions of them. They reprinted them. Until quite recently, you can buy copies. And there's an interesting publication in the library based on the Japanese photo books. But it must be a really interesting history if you did a complete research of the history of modernity in relationship to the publications which went with modernity. You'd find that most publications lasted for a year, 2 years. The nature of modernity was it's eruptive to begin with. It came out of a confluence of forces which were more like an explosion than when artists, for instance, started to write. People got really fed up with the influence of Greenberg and the authority of the critic. And so one of the explosions was for the artists to start doing their own writing. So a lot of the 60s artists, a lot of the minimal artists and conceptual artists did most of the writing on that movement. So you had a lot of shows which were based on documents and publications rather than on visual artifacts. Often shows took the form of documents. So the whole history just in conceptual art alone of publication. It's a 2-3 year research project for somebody. Make a great PhD. But I went to see an exhibition of at Odevas Gallery just on Savile Row, and they've got a show which relates to the portraiture of Bacon and Warhol, who met in Paris together. And in the basement, they've got all these documents which pertain to those two meeting and the conjunction between the two of them. Are there any other thoughts, or
I have a thought, something that occurred to me when at the near the beginning of the lecture, those tentacularities was written on one of the publications. That's something, that's a phrase I associate with Donna Haraway, but it obviously those thoughts were predating Donna Haraway by several decades, actually. So I was wondering what you might be able to say about that concept.
I didn't quite get the. It's breaking up.
Sorry. I might drop out and rejoin on my phone.
Yeah.
When I do that, I'll ask again.
The world's largest collection of magazines is in Woolwich. It's called HiMag. It's someone's personal collection. There's thousands of I don't know what you call popular magazines. So maybe they have some media guy who just was obsessed about collecting magazines. Maybe they have those ones. Anyway, it's called HiMag, HYMAG. It's in Woolwich.
I think we don't necessarily pay attention to the idea of zines and magazines and writings by artists and critical thinkers and philosophers. It has huge impact on the arts. It's discussion forum, really. Quite often, you'll buy a magazine, read it, you might wait another 4 months, buy another one or a different one, and you're just sort of absorbing ideas and thoughts, and looking at to see what other artists are doing. So it's an important part of the history of art. I guess. Well, it is, not even I guess. But it's not really, once we don't acknowledge that enough.
I mean, it was an interesting change in the Royal College when we went from typed documents to when the technology changed and you got desktop publishing, people started doing small editions of their thesis and made them as books. So even that local history was interesting. It gave rise to some really interesting, in fact, small publications which almost have no, on the surface, no impact, but some of them got quite big readerships just through word of mouth. And the last question, then we'll shift to Jessica. Let's go to Jessica. And it's 1 hour, and we've obviously got to go from making improvised remarks to going to more structured considerations, and beginning of a process. We've got to sort of find forms to do this, so everyone can have a slot. So by week, if this works, we spend an hour looking at someone's artwork or exhibitions. You present in the way you want to present. You can either present multiple works or a work. But I thought it'd be good to start with Jessica because she's done a complete work based on she went to Sweden on a placement. So it's a whole project and involves a technological issue. So if Jessica can take over and present the